Plaintiff Dawn Angelique Richard, by and through her attorneys, the Bloom firm IP Legal Studio LLC, brings this action against defendants. Ms. Richards alleges upon knowledge concerning her own experience and upon information and belief as to all other matters. Dawn Angelique Richard, known professionally as Dawn Richard, is an American musician, singer-songwriter and performer. She gained widespread recognition as a member of the girl group Danity Kane, formed by defendant Sean Combs, and later transitioned into a key member of Mr. Combs' brand Diddy, Dirty Money. Defendant Sean Combs, a once celebrated hip-hop mogul, popularly known by his stage names Puff Daddy. Puff Daddy, Diddy or Love skyrocketed to fame in the late 1900s and became a powerful and enduring figure in the music and entertainment industry. In 1998, Mr. Combs explained the origins of his stage name in a USA Today interview. His nickname was Puff because he had a temper and was known to huff and puff when he was angry. Over the decades following his rise to fame, Mr. Combs' star-studded, larger-than-life persona overshadowed his vicious temper and pervasive acts of violence directed towards those in his inner circle, specifically women. Mr. Combs' namesake temper frequently manifested in physical violence. Mr. Combs regularly hurled objects in fits of rage, often throwing items such as mobile phones, laptops, food, and studio equipment across the room or at people. On numerous occasions, Miss Richard witnessed Mr. Combs brutally beat his girlfriend, Miss Cassandra Cassie Ventura. His persistent abuse included choking and strangling Miss Ventura, striking her with his hands and with objects, slapping her, punching her, and throwing items at her, including a scalding hot pan. On many occasions, Ms. Richard tried to intervene, offering Ms. Ventura support and encouragement to leave Mr. Combs. Each time, Mr. Combs learned of her efforts to help Ms. Ventura and became enraged, threatening Ms. Richard's life with statements such as, "You want to die today? I may go missing and I am people." Compounding Mr. Combs' violent acts and death threats, he flagrantly exploited Ms. Richards' musical talent as a singer and writer while withholding her rightful earnings, stealing her copyrighted works, and subjecting her to years of inhumane working conditions, which included groping, assault, and false imprisonment, among other violations. For nearly a decade, Mr. Combs manipulated Ms. Richard with mantras that submission to his depraved demands was necessary for career advancement, instilling in her the belief that such abuse and exploitation were required for female artists to succeed in the music industry. It was not until Ms. Ventura's bravery in coming forward that Ms. Richard realized her own personal suffering was tied to the many years of abuse by Mr. Combs that had become normalized for her. As more women courageously came forward, Plaintiff has been empowered by this collective strength and now adds her voice to the growing chorus of victims bravely sharing their harrowing stories. Together they seek justice and stand in solidarity as the latest victims of the Me Too movement in the music industry. Ms. Dawn Angelique Richard is a resident of the state of California and was employed by defendants Remote Productions Incorporated, New Remote Productions Incorporated, Bad Boy Entertainment LLC, Bad Boy Entertainment Holdings LLC, Bad Boy Productions Holding Inc., Bad Boy Books Holding Inc., The Sean Combs Music Inc., Sean Combs Capital LLC, and Combs Enterprises LLC, hereinafter collectively Bad Boy Records, from 2005 until 2012. At all relevant times herein, Ms. Richard met the definition of an employee of defendant Bad Boy Records and related entities. At all relevant times herein, Ms. Richard was a resident of the state of New York. Defendant Sean Combs, upon information and belief, resides within the state of California. At all relevant times herein, Mr. Combs met the definition of an employer of Ms. Richard under all relevant statutes. Defendant Harve Pierre, Mr. Pierre, upon information and belief, resides within the state of New Jersey. At all times relevant herein, Defendant Harve Pierre was the president of Bad Boy Entertainment and Bad Boy Records in New York, and met the definition of an employer of Ms. Richards under all relevant statutes. Defendant Remote Productions Inc. and New Remote Productions Inc. are Delaware corporations and television production companies which, upon information and belief, were created by Mr. Combs to produce Making the Band in New York and in California. At all relevant times herein, RPI and NRPI employed Ms. Richard under all relevant statutes. Okay, blah, 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 blah. This bit is so boring. It's just literally going through and listing every single one of his, of P. Diddy's corporations and his groups, just basically saying who is under, who she's suing. So they mentioned Defendant Bad Boy Entertainment's holding, Defendant Bad Boy Production holding, Defendant Bad Boy Books Holdings, Defendant The Sean Combs Music Inc., Defendant Universal Music Group, Geffen A&M Records, Defendant Diego America's Supply, Ciroc Distilling Company in New York, Defendant Combs Wines and Spirits LLC. It just seems that he's got like loads of little companies with other little companies like spin-off. Defendant Janice Combs Publishing Inc., Defendant Janice Combs Publishing Holdings, Defendant Sony Songs, Defendant Love Records, Defendant Epic Records. Okay. Right, so this is the actual important part, the factual allegations. Ms. Richard is selected to be in Mr. Combs' all-female musical group Danity Kane after competing on MTV's Making the Band. In or around 2004, Ms. Richard was selected to participate in Season 3 of MTV Network's reality television show Making the Band. The show centered around the formation and development of a new musical group under the mentorship of Mr. Combs. The contestants would compete and be chosen by Mr. Combs to form a band, which would go on to create albums and perform. For aspiring artists like Ms. Richard, Making the Band represented a concrete path to a career in the entertainment industry. Ms. Richard appeared in seasons 3 and 4 of Making the Band, which first aired in 2005, and in season 5 of Making His Band, which aired in 2009. Out of thousands of contestants, Ms. Richard, along with approximately 12 other women, were selected to participate in season 3 of Making the Band. 5 women, including Ms. Richard, were ultimately chosen to be in the group Danity Kane, which was named by Ms. Richard. Prior to and including the first Danity Kane album, Making the Band was filmed entirely at Daddy's house recording studio at 3120 Street, New York, New York. The Making the Band content that focused on Danity Kane's work on its second album, Welcome to the Dollhouse, was filmed at Daddy's house and at Mr. Combs' Miami residence. Other Making the Band episodes include in Los Angeles as a third filming location. Upon information and belief to create Making the Band, camera crews filmed 24 hours a day, gathering months' worth of footage to condense into mere hours of entertainment for viewers. Danity Kane released its self-titled debut album in August 2006 and its second album, Welcome to the Dollhouse, in March 2008. Danity Kane's first album sold over 4 million copies. Damages to Ms. Richards for unpaid salaries are estimated at, is that 1 billion? 1 million? 100 million? I don't know. Danity Kane's second album, Welcome to the Dollhouse, sold over 2 million copies. Damages to Ms. Richard for unpaid salaries and royalties are estimated at, is that 500 million? Damages on unpaid wages for touring on over 100 dates for Ms. Richard with Danity Kane are estimated at 1.8 million. Guys, I'm not sure. Mr. Combs fired bandmate Aubrey O'Day and Juanita D. Woodgett from Danity Kane on live television at the height of its fame in 2008, which resulted in Danity Kane being disbanded in 2009. During the auditions and on the set of making the band, Mr. Combs projected an aura of superiority, wealth and power. Mr. Combs regularly wore sunglasses and avoided looking the female contestants in the eyes, contributing to an atmosphere of uncertainty and intimidation. During auditions, Mr. Combs spoke to the female contestants in a hostile, condescending manner, making disparaging gender-based remarks such as calling them fat, ugly, bitches, and hoes. Ms. Richard felt threatened and intimidated by Mr. Combs' blatant disdain for the young women, like herself, who were excited for the opportunity to be on his show. Once the ban was made, Mr. Combs' contempt for women was readily apparent as he continued to display aggressive and hostile behaviour towards Ms. Richard and her all-female Danity Kane bandmates. Mr. Combs regularly referred to the 5 women as B and hoes and denigrated their physical appearances. By way of example, Mr. Combs stated that Ms. Richard was too skinny and needed to do something about her face. Oh God. On one occasion, in or around 2005, during the first season of Making the Band 3, Ms. Richard observed Mr. Combs' ex-partner and the mother of 3 of his children, Kim Porter, leaving Mr. Combs' recording studio in tears with visible facial injuries, included a lacerated lip. Realizing that Mr. Combs was capable of committing acts of violence against women caused Ms. Richard to feel deep apprehension and fear that Mr. Combs could one day physically harm her. Ms. Richard was present when Mr. Combs was introduced to Cassandra Cassie Ventura for the first time in or around 2006. The moment Mr. Combs first saw Ms. Ventura, his demeanour noticeably shifted. Mr. Combs positioned himself directly in front of Ms. Ventura's seat, invading her personal space, and fixated on her with an intense, unyielding stare, isolating her from the other people in the room, including Ms. Ventura's then boyfriend, music producer Ryan Leslie. Coincidentally, this first meeting between Mr. Combs and Ms. Ventura was the first time that Ms. Richard was in Mr. Combs' presence without a camera crew filming. Observing Mr. Combs behave in such an intimidating, predatory manner the first time that they were off camera made Ms. Richard feel deeply apprehensive and afraid of him. Subsequently, Ms. Ventura ended her relationship with Mr. Leslie and began dating Mr. Combs, who had become violent and abusive towards her. For the majority of Ms. Richards' tenure as a member of Danity Kane and Diddy Dirty Money, Mr. Combs required her to remain at his various residences and studios in New York, Los Angeles, Florida, and New Jersey for activities such as recording, rehearsing, dressing, preparing costumes, and exercising. Throughout the productions of Making the Band 3 and 4, Mr. Combs deprived Ms. Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates of basic needs such as adequate food and sleep. When Ms. Richards or her Danity Kane bandmates requested meals or rest, Mr. Combs refused and chastised them with derogatory comments like, "You bees don't want this," or "Y'all are not hungry enough, and I'm paying you bees to work." This demeaning behaviour gradually undermined Ms. Richards' confidence and contributed significantly to her growing feelings of insecurity and fear of reprisal from Mr. Combs. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs would regularly be awake for prolonged periods of time because he was high on drugs. During these periods, Mr. Combs demanded continuous access to Ms. Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates, often forcing them to record and rehearse for stretches of 36 to 48 hours without breaks. Forced to choose between eating and sleeping, Ms. Richard lost a significant amount of weight, weighing approximately 100 pounds at a height of 5'4". Ms. Richard began to normalize these extreme conditions and perceive them as standard requirements of her participation in Danity Kane. Mr. Combs regularly sent his associates to wake Ms. Richards and her Danity Kane bandmates in the overnight hours so he could watch them rehearse. The regularity of these disturbances led Ms. Richard to adapt by sleeping in a sitting position, fully dressed, with makeup on, heightening her anxiety. Over time, this abnormal sleeping arrangement came to feel routine, further normalizing Mr. Combs' invasive demands. In addition to exhausting rehearsals, Mr. Combs required Ms. Richard and her bandmates to participate in intense workouts with a personal trainer. On one occasion, while running on the beach, Ms. Richard became so dehydrated that she vomited. Instead of offering medical assistance, MTV Network's camera crew filmed the incident, contributing to her acceptance of such treatment as part of her professional life. The unrelenting and rigorous schedule of rehearsals, performance, and near constant filming that Mr. Combs imposed caused Miss Richard to experience extreme weight loss, dehydration, fatigue, and painful rashes from the microphone pack she was required to wear on her back. These conditions intensified Ms. Richard's feeling of powerlessness as she increasingly viewed them as part of her professional reality and feared the consequences of any resistance. In a further assertion of power and dominance, Mr. Combs insisted on holding meetings while dressed only in his underwear. On one occasion in 2008 at his Miami residence, Mr. Combs emailed Ms. Richard directing her to meet him in the living room. When she arrived, he was wearing only his underwear. Ms. Richard asked Mr. Combs to put clothes on, but he refused, stating, "This is my effing house." Mr. Combs then conducted a meeting lasting approximately an hour while dressed in his underwear, causing Ms. Richard to feel violated and embarrassed, and amplifying her feelings of powerlessness. Following the official Danity Kane breakup in early 2009, effectuated by Mr. Combs, Ms. Richard experienced significant financial hardship, with no prospective opportunities for employment within the entertainment field. Ms. Richard spent several months traveling from Baltimore to Daddy's house recording studio in New York without pay or allocated budget. Mr. Combs promised that Ms. Richard's compositions would result in payment of license fees and royalties pursuant to her contract with Bad Boy Records. However, no such compensation was ever reported or paid to Ms. Richard. Damages relative to these continuing copyright infringements will be proved at trial. By approximately the fall of 2009, many of Ms. Richard's compositions had been recorded by other Bad Boy Records artists. Due to the success of her compositions, Ms. Richard was invited to meet with musical artist Kalena Harper, Ms. Harper, and shortly thereafter Mr. Combs, Ms. Richard, and Ms. Harper formed a new group, Diddy, Dirty Money. Initial recording for Diddy, Dirty Money's album, Last Train to Paris, took place in Mr. Combs' home on Dohoney Drive in LA, California. On the first day of recording, Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper arrived at Mr. Combs' home and waited in the kitchen, where Mr. Combs' girlfriend, Ms. Jorah, was frying eggs for him. Ms. Richard observed Mr. Combs come down the stairs looking high on drugs, enter the kitchen, approach Ms. Ventura and scream, "I've been asking you for I can't stand you, B. You never do it right." Mr. Combs pushed Ms. Ventura against the wall and choked her, then picked up the scalding hot pan of eggs and threw it at her, causing her to fall to the ground in a fetal position. Cursing and screaming, Mr. Combs dragged Ms. Ventura up the stairs. Frozen in shock and terror, Ms. Richard heard glass shattering, crashing, and banging noises as Mr. Combs dragged Ms. Ventura up the stairs. Ms. Richard wanted to intervene and help Ms. Ventura, but Ms. Harper adamantly refused to interfere in Mr. Combs' relationship and physically led Ms. Richard out of the residence. Terrified and shaken, Ms. Richard returned to her hotel where she was unable to sleep due to worrying about Ms. Ventura and her own safety. The following day, Ms. Richard received a call demanding that she return to Mr. Combs' residence to continue recording. Mr. Combs brought Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper into the recording room at his studio, locked the door and dimmed the lights, and gave each of them flowers. Mr. Combs went on at length stating, "This is normal. This was just a lover's argument where no one was hurt. This is what love is. I'm giving you an opportunity. If you want to make it, you'll shut your mouth. If you say anything, there will be consequences." Mr. Combs further warned that people end up missing. Being threatened while locked for over 20 minutes in a small enclosed space with Mr. Combs after observing Mr. Combs violently assault Ms. Ventura the day before, Ms. Richard was terrified and genuinely believed that Mr. Combs would follow through on his threats. In or around November 2009, after the Soul Train Awards in Atlanta, Georgia, Mr. Combs flew Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper to his house in New York on his private jet for an after party. There were many well-known celebrities at the after party, and copious amounts of illegal drugs were being openly consumed. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs had arranged for dozens of young women and girls, some of whom appeared to be underage, to be transported to the party. The women arrived wearing little to no clothing and were given drugs and alcohol. Many of them appeared lethargic or passed out while Mr. Combs and his guests performed sexual acts on them. Ms. Richard believed that her presence at the party was a test to see whether Mr. Combs could trust her. Mr. Combs repeatedly said things like, "This is a buffet, enjoy yourselves. This is what we do, this is how we party." Ms. Richard felt shocked and horrified at the sight of Mr. Combs and his guests violating incapacitated young women, and implored Mr. Combs' personal assistant Capricorn Clark to allow her to leave. Ms. Clark insisted that Ms. Richard wait 15 minutes for Ms. Clark to make it make sense. That is, to make Ms. Richard's exit less conspicuous so that Mr. Combs would not notice that she had left. Knowing that she was not free to leave and had to wait for Ms. Clark's help to help her orchestrate her departure, Ms. Richard experienced feelings of panic and being trapped against her will. Mr. Combs regularly placed Ms. Richards in similar situations with no means to escape. At Mr. Combs' drug-fueled parties, his guests, including Ms. Richards, were required to surrender their phones upon entry. Mr. Combs kept the doors locked and guarded by security personnel, making it impossible for Ms. Richard to leave without alerting Mr. Combs that she had done so. Mr. Combs hired police officers to attend his parties, sending a clear message to guests that his influence extended to law enforcement officers, and creating a climate of fear and a tacit warning that reporting him to authorities would be both unacceptable and futile. On many occasions, Mr. Combs had parties at his Miami, Florida residence that lasted for several days. At one of the parties, Ms. Richard witnessed Mr. Combs openly stating that he had arranged for busloads of young, exotic girls, such as mixed black and Asian, Indonesian and albino. Once again, Ms. Richard observed inebriated young girls being sexually violated by Mr. Combs and his guests. In a state of panic and terror, Ms. Richard fled to the bedroom Mr. Combs had insisted she stay in and barricaded the door shut with furniture. Mr. Combs openly assaulted Ms. Ventura in front of Ms. Richard and other witnesses on multiple occasions. On one occasion, in or around the fall of 2009, Diddy Dirty Money was in New York preparing to perform at a festival. Inside their vehicle, Mr. Combs grabbed Ms. Ventura's neck, pulled her out of the van onto the grass and pinned her head down, choking her while yelling, "You're gonna get effed up today." This incident took place in the backstage area just outside the festival and was entirely visible to passers-by. In another instance, in or around early 2010, Mr. Combs punched Ms. Ventura in the face in the bathroom of a party in LA. Frequently, when Ms. Ventura attempted to voice an opinion or stand up to Mr. Combs, he would strike her or wrap his hands around her throat and choke her. On the first several occasions that they observed Mr. Combs assault Ms. Ventura, Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper spoke with Ms. Ventura to support and encourage Ms. Ventura in escaping her abusive relationship with Mr. Combs. Every time that Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper tried to intervene, Mr. Combs learned of the conversation and became irate. Mr. Combs screamed at the women, "Y'all bees don't get in my relationship. Don't tell my bee what she need to be doing. Just make money and shut the F up. I end artists. I shelve careers. You could be missing and you bees want to die today," among other threats. In or around late 2009 or early 2010, Bad Boy Entertainment entered an agreement with Interscope Geffen A&M Records. Upon information and belief, Bad Boy was paid $50 million in exchange for Bad Boy's future releases being distributed through Interscope. In doing so, Mr. Combs intended to capitalize on Interscope's significant resources and enhance the promotion and sales of Bad Boy's releases, including Diddy Dirty Money's upcoming album. In the weeks and months leading up to the Bad Boy Interscope deal, Mr. Combs had frequent meetings with producer and then CEO of Interscope Records, Jimmy Iovine. On one such occasion, Combs hosted a dinner at a West Hollywood, California restaurant, which Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper were required to attend. Among the guests at the dinner were celebrities like Neo and USHER, as well as Mr. Iovine. At the dinner, Mr. Combs and Ms. Ventura had an argument. In front of the other guests, Mr. Combs hissed at Ms. Ventura in a screaming whisper and forcefully punched her in the stomach, causing her to double over in visible pain. Crying, Ms. Clark escorted Ms. Ventura out of the restaurant, and Mr. Combs remained and continued socializing with the dinner guests. At this point, Interscope Records clearly had actual knowledge that Combs was dangerous around females and that Combs was willing to brazenly batter a female in public. Even after Mr. Iovine watched Mr. Combs commit a violent assault in front of numerous high-profile witnesses, the Bad Boy Interscope deal took place and remained in effect, providing Mr. Combs with immense financial awards and enabling him to commit further acts of violence without fear of repercussions. Watching Mr. Combs openly assault Ms. Ventura in front of Mr. Iovine and various celebrities, and observing that other powerful music industry representatives were complicit in Mr. Combs' behavior, amplified by Ms. Richards' fears that Mr. Combs could one day harm her, and that his actions would be accepted and normalized by everyone surrounding him. As part of the agreement between Bad Boy and Interscope, Interscope heavily promoted Diddy, Dirty Money's Last Train to Paris album. Mr. Iovine had presented Mr. Combs with a demo of Coming Home for him to produce, a song that would become a multi-platinum hit. Mr. Iovine was encouraging Mr. Combs to develop a new sound for the album, in which Interscope was investing significant resources. Ms. Richard, Ms. Harper and Ms. Ventura all provided vocal performances for this project, released in November 2010. The album, Last Train to Paris, became Diddy Dirty Money's most commercially successful project, providing vast financial rewards to both Interscope and Mr. Combs. In or around the fall of 2009, Diddy Dirty Money began recording the song Love Comes Down. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs continued to use drugs that caused him to remain awake for prolonged periods of time. When he was awake, he would demand that Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper record in the studio, where they would spend 3 to 4 consecutive days recording without a break to eat or sleep. Mr. Combs required Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper to remain at his home continuously, denying the opportunity to return to their hotel rooms for breaks. The degree of control Mr. Combs exercised over Miss Richards' daily life and basic needs exaggerated the significant power imbalance and threatening atmosphere that ensured Miss Richards' compliance with his demands. Mr. Combs regularly left the studio and required Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper to stay and write verses to songs. Occasionally, Ms. Richard tried to leave to get something to eat or to go to her hotel. Whenever Ms. Richard tried to leave, Mr. Combs would call and demand, "Where the F are you? And we have an album to make." Mr. Combs frequently made threats, especially if they asked for food or rest, stating, "You're a B. I don't want to see your effing face. I make ends go missing," and "I make things go away." Each time, Ms. Richard returned to the studio immediately, believing that Mr. Combs was capable of following through with his threats. Mr. Combs criticised Ms. Richard for being too skinny, yet denied her request for food and demanded that she drink only peanut butter shakes. Mr. Combs had full meals prepared by a chef and ate them in front of Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper, never offering them food. Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper begged for food and rest breaks, but Mr. Combs refused, making statements such as, "Absolutely effing not," and "This is what it takes to be great." Mr. Combs' responses underscored the threat he posed and heightened Ms. Richards' concerns for her safety and well-being. As Ms. Richard continued to work non-stop, transitioning between the studio rehearsals, workouts, and back to the studio, she became severely dehydrated and experienced chronic stomach cramping from being undernourished and excessively thin. On the numerous occasions that she told Mr. Combs that she was not feeling well, he called her lazy and dismissed her health concerns, instilling in her further apprehension of communicating her needs. In or around the summer of 2010, Ms. Richard experienced abdominal pain, swollen glands, and a fever. She was hospitalized and diagnosed with arthralgia, joint pain due to overuse, sprains, and infection. Anemia and a low white blood cell count. Ms. Richard presented Mr. Combs with her medical records specifying that she needed to emphasize eating well, being adequately hydrated, and getting adequate rest, but Mr. Combs ordered her to report to the studio the next day for another multi-day recording session. Mr. Combs' blatant disregard for her health and well-being cemented Ms. Richards' fear of his authority and control over her career and health. Ms. Richard continued to witness Mr. Combs' abuse towards Ms. Ventura. Ms. Ventura often wore sunglasses and makeup in an attempt to hide visible injuries. These incidents further solidified Ms. Richards' fear of Mr. Combs, as they were constant reminders of the physical dangers she potentially could and eventually would face. Mr. Combs often exhibited uncontrollable anger during recording sessions, throwing objects like albums, laptops, and food against the wall or at individuals. Mr. Combs frequently flew into frenzied, unpredictable rages. Ms. Richard feared making any misstep that could direct his anger towards her. However, her fears went beyond her immediate physical safety, because she had witnessed Mr. Combs' violent nature, a side of Mr. Combs that the world had not seen yet. She feared that falling out of Mr. Combs' good graces, or worse, standing up to him or speaking out against him, could result in serious harm to her. Ms. Richard frequently thought about Mr. Combs' threat about making people go missing, and feared taking any action that could label her as a target. Despite Mr. Combs' violence, threats, and misogyny, Diddy Dirty Money experienced significant sales of records, selling over 2 million copies of one single, 500,000 of another in the US, and in Australia 5 million single copies. Ms. Richards' unpaid wages and royalties are estimated at 1.2 million. Ms. Richards' unpaid touring wages are estimated at over $350,000 for touring dates within the United States alone. In or around the summer of 2009, Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper were required by Mr. Combs to perform as part of Diddy Dirty Money and attend numerous promotional events, including late or overnight parties, all of which were under contract between Mr. Combs and Ciroc Vodka, or between Mr. Combs and Diddy Beats, pursuant to the Bad Boy Interscope record deal. Ms. Richard was never compensated for the extra time she spent fulfilling Mr. Combs' promotional contracts, including the Ciroc and the Diddy Beats campaign. Mr. Combs was paid approximately $250,000 per Ciroc appearance. Mr. Combs did not compensate Ms. Richard or Ms. Harper for these appearances, other than just $5,000 each on a handful of occasions. Mr. Combs' ongoing explanation for withholding compensation was that their appearances were a requirement for their tour. Additionally, Ms. Richard was required to appear and to promote Diddy Beats through parties, album songs, and videos. Over time, Mr. Combs was paid $6.25 million for 25 Ciroc shows that Ms. Richard was required to attend. Following each show, Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper approached Mr. Combs to inquire about their insufficient and sporadic payments. Mr. Combs routinely responded with statements such as, "You bees aren't grateful," and "You don't want this." Ms. Richard estimates losses from Ciroc campaign promotions totaling at least $1.5 million. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs received an advance on Diddy Beats for which Ms. Richard received no compensation. Between approximately 2009 and 2011, throughout Diddy Dirty Money's recording process, rehearsals and performance, Mr. Combs repeatedly ordered Ms. Richard to strip down to her underwear. He frequently referred to her as a bee or a whore and made demeaning remarks about her body, alternatingly calling her lazy, fat, ugly and skinny, particularly in front of his friends, producers and bodyguards. Mr. Combs frequently held meetings with Ms. Richards wearing only his underwear, despite Ms. Richards' protests and repeated requests for him to put on clothing. In response, Mr. Combs called her a bee and a whore and reminded her that she should be grateful for the opportunity to be there. Often while they were recording in the studio, Mr. Combs would hold parties where he would invite young men and women who were often scantily dressed and appeared underage to use drugs and engage in sex acts. Ms. Richard observed Mr. Combs and his colleagues kissing, groping and inappropriately touching the young women. Upon information and belief, the participants often left the immediate area to have sex and returned shortly after. On numerous occasions between approximately 2009 and 2011, under the guise of preparing for performances, Mr. Combs would intrude into Ms. Richards' changing room at Daddy's house unannounced while Ms. Richard was undressed. Even though a female stylist was present and assisting Ms. Richard with her wardrobe, Mr. Combs would grope Ms. Richards' body, including her bare buttocks and her chest area near her breasts. With no legitimate purpose and without Ms. Richard's consent, Mr. Combs caressed her buttocks to show the stylist where he wanted her high-waisted panties positioned, and attempted to touch her breasts, claiming to show the stylist where he wanted her bra straps to go. When Mr. Combs would enter the changing room, Ms. Richard would cover up her chest with her hands to prevent Mr. Combs from seeing or touching her breasts. When Mr. Combs would touch her body, Ms. Richard would attempt to swat his hands away and state, "Don't touch me." Mr. Combs frequently smacked Ms. Richards' bare buttocks and often commented on her body, noting that although she was too skinny, she had an ass. Ignoring her visible and communicated discomfort, Mr. Combs persisted and continued to intrude when Ms. Richard was in the dressing room, continued to touch her buttocks and breast area under the guise of showing the stylist what to do, and continued to smack her buttocks without consent. In or around October 2010, Diddy, Dirty Money performed in Glasgow, Scotland, where Mr. Combs engaged in overt sexual advances toward Ms. Richard on numerous occasions. When Ms. Richard exited the dressing room fully styled, Mr. Combs looked at her approvingly and smacked her buttocks while making comments such as, "You're good looking," "Okay, Dawn, okay, I see what it is," in a flirtatious tone. Each time, Ms. Richard moved away and asked him not to touch her, but Mr. Combs disregarded her protests. On their last night in Glasgow, Ms. Richard witnessed Mr. Combs and several other males gangbanging Mr. Combs' female assistant at the hotel pool. Ms. Richard immediately left and went to her hotel room. On their flight back to the United States the next day, Ms. Richard asked Mr. Combs where his assistant was. Mr. Combs replied, "I don't give a F where that bee is." Ms. Richard later learned that Mr. Combs had taken his assistant's passport with him to the United States, leaving the assistant stranded in the United Kingdom. In Glasgow, Ms. Harper confided in Ms. Richard that her husband and manager, Tony Vick, was abusive. After an especially severe assault, she confided in Ms. Richard that she wanted to leave Mr. Vick, and Ms. Richard helped her to plan her exit from the relationship. However, Ms. Harper and Mr. Vick reconciled, and both Mr. Combs and Mr. Vick, who had a close relationship, learned of Ms. Richard's role in helping Ms. Harper. Both Mr. Combs and Mr. Vick became noticeably distrustful of Ms. Richard, which exaggerated her fears of harm and reprisal. When Mr. Combs would require his Diddy, Dirty Money bandmates to stay at his residence in Miami, Ms. Richard would barricade herself inside her room at night, placing heavy furniture against the door because she feared being harmed in her sleep. In or around late December 2010, Ms. Richard, Ms. Harper and Ms. Ventura were in Mr. Combs' LA home when Mr. Combs stated, "I want to gift you fake boobs for Christmas." Mr. Combs reached out and cupped Ms. Richards' breast without her permission and stated, "You're an A, I'm thinking D." Ms. Richard recoiled in shock and left the room. Throughout the above-mentioned time period, when Ms. Richard resisted Mr. Combs' advances, Mr. Combs retaliated by denying her singing parts in songs, removing her from songs, refusing to allow her to sing in performances, and turning her microphone off during performances. The more Ms. Richard rebuffed his advance, the more Mr. Combs' retaliatory behavior increased. In or around December 2010, Diddy Dirty Money was preparing for an upcoming performance on Saturday Night Live. As usual, rehearsals lasted for days without the opportunity to eat or rest, and the rehearsal schedule was unpredictable. After waiting all day for Mr. Combs to call or send a car, Ms. Richard received a phone call from Mr. Combs demanding, "Where the F are you bees? You bees don't want this. Y'all don't deserve to have someone pick you up. Get a cab." Ms. Richard and Ms. Harper immediately took a taxi to SUR Studios at 520 West St. Street, anxious because Mr. Combs sounded enraged. Upon their arrival at SUR Studios, Mr. Combs and Harve Pierre were waiting for them in the lobby. Mr. Combs screamed obscenities at them. "Where the F were you bees? You bees don't want to win. You don't want this. I'm so tired of y'all." Ms. Richard noticed that people in the lobby were reacting to Mr. Combs' tirade. Embarrassed, Ms. Richard asked Mr. Combs to stop swearing and calling them bees in front of everyone. Mr. Combs' facial expression shifted as he stepped towards Ms. Richard, raised his arm and swung his fist toward her face. Believing that Mr. Combs was going to hit her, Ms. Richard braced for the impact. Before Mr. Combs could strike her, Mr. Combs' bodyguard grabbed her, escorted her out of the studio and forced her into the Bad Boys Records Bentley that was parked outside. Ms. Harper ran after Ms. Richard, and Mr. Combs' bodyguard closed and locked the Bentley doors with both women inside. Inside the vehicle, Ms. Richard realized that there were no interior door handles and that they were locked inside with no way to escape. Ms. Richard's belongings were in the studio, but she was able to call her father from Ms. Harper's cell phone. Ms. Richard relayed to her father what had happened and that she needed help and feared that she would go missing. Moments later, Mr. Combs' bodyguard removed only Ms. Harper from the Bentley, leaving Ms. Richard locked in the car alone for over 2 hours. Ms. Richard screamed as loudly as she could, but no one responded. It was late evening in the winter time, the windows were heavily tinted, and the interior of the car was dark except for faint interior lights. Ms. Richards' belongings and winter coat were in the studio, while the ignition was off and there was no heat. With Mr. Combs' prior threats and violence running through her mind, Ms. Richard felt sheer panic, terror and feelings of claustrophobia at being locked in a small, dark, enclosed space with no way to communicate or call for help. She began to feel cold and feared for her life, and not knowing when or if she would be released. Ms. Richards' father drove to New York from Baltimore and arrived at the studio approximately 2 hours later. Only after her father arrived and demanded to see her did Mr. Pierre order Mr. Combs' bodyguard to release Miss Richard from the vehicle. Mr. Pierre ushered Ms. Richards' father between several rooms at USHER Studios, where he waited for approximately 2 hours before being able to confront Mr. Combs. Once Ms. Richards' father expressed that he intended to contact police, Mr. Combs warned him to think about your family and think about your daughter's career. Her father appeared visibly frightened by Mr. Combs' threats and actions, which in turn made Ms. Richard feel terrified for herself and for her family's safety. The next night, Diddy, Dirty Money performed on SNL. Mr. Combs subsequently called Ms. Richard, complimented her performance and concluded with a threat: "You don't call your dad unless you're in the hospital." As a member of Danity Kane, Ms. Richard has performed on over 15 songs and holds composition credits for more than 3 songs. Defendants have failed to account to or pay Ms. Richard as agreed for her compositions and her performances, and have breached contracts and infringed her copyrights, all of which has unjustly enriched defendants. As a member of Diddy Dirty Money, Ms. Richard has performances recording on over 9 songs. Additionally, Ms. Richard has composition rights and credits on more than 5 songs. Defendants have failed to account to or pay Ms. Richard as agreed for her compositions and her performances, and breached contracts and or infringed her copyrights, unjustly enriching defendants. In 2020, Mr. Combs selected Ms. Richard for a reboot of Making the Band, and Ms. Richard spent hours preparing to be a judge on the new show. However, the COVID-19 pandemic halted those plans, and Ms. Richard was never compensated in any way. On or about July the 1st, 2021, Mr. Combs and Bad Boy Records directed Janice Combs Publishing Inc. to assign its administration rights of Ms. Richards' songs held from her tenure with defendants in the years 2005 to 2012 to Sony Songs, a division of Sony Music Publishing. The assignment, signed by Ms. Richard on October the 22nd, 2024, purported to credit, through a semi-annual accounting, Ms. Richards' royalty account for Ms. Richards' compositions from between 80 to 90% of publishers' share. However, no statements were ever provided, no payments were ever made, and no reversions nor assignment were ever recorded with performing rights organizations or other royalty collecting entities by defendants or by Sony defendants have wholly failed to account to or pay Ms. Richard as agreed for her compositions and her performances in breach of the assignment, and have thereby infringed her copyrights, resulting in defendants being unjustly enriched. During the summer of 2023, Mr. Combs' new record company, Love Records Inc., tendered a contract for negotiation to Ms. Richards for the song entitled Deliver Me, embodied as track 3 on the Love album, Off the Grid. Officially released on September 15, 2023, upon information and belief, Deliver Me sold well prior to Mr. Combs' legal troubles in November 2023, continuing to the present. Ms. Richards sought to establish her rightful percentage as a 21% composer on Deliver Me. Mr. Combs personally called Ms. Richard and left a voicemail complaining about her fair requests. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs directed his attorneys to avoid confirming the composition percentages on the song, and in fact list composers who played no part in composing the song. As a result, the contract was never signed by either Ms. Richard or Love Records Inc. Nevertheless, Ms. Richard obtained a copyright registration certificate on a timely basis. Said registration lists authors, claimants as agreed when the song was created in 2009. The registration is filed separately in the court and supports Ms. Richards' claim of copyright infringement by defendants herein. Defendants Love Records, and Mr. Combs infringed Ms. Richards' copyrights in the composition of Deliver Me by releasing Deliver Me without Ms. Richards' permission and without compensation. As a result of the acts and conducts complained of herein, Ms. Richard has suffered and will continue to suffer the loss of income, wages, benefits, royalties, promotional fees, touring fees, and other compensation. Ms. Richard has also suffered, among other things, future pecuniary losses, emotional pain, suffering, inconvenience, loss of enjoyment of life, PTSD, anxiety disorder, insomnia, panic attacks, and other pecuniary losses entitling her to an award of compensatory and punitive damages. Injunctive and declaratory relief, attorney's fees and costs, and other remedies at this court may deem appropriate. Plaintiff repeats and re-alleges each and every allegation in all of the preceding paragraphs as if fully set forth herein. The above described conduct of Mr. Combs, including but not limited to Mr. Combs' physical and sexual assaults, harassment, and unlawful imprisonment of plaintiff in New York City, constitutes a crime of violence against plaintiff and is a crime of violence motivated by gender, as defined in 10103 of the New York VGM VPL. The term crime of violence means an active series of acts that would constitute a misdemeanor or a felony against the person as defined in state or federal law if the conduct presents a serious risk of physical injury to another, whether or not those acts have actually resulted in criminal charges, prosecution, or conviction. And the term crime of violence motivated by gender means a crime of violence committed because of gender or on the basis of gender and due at least in part to an animus based on the victim's gender. The above described conduct of Mr. Combs, including but not limited to sexual assault, physical assault, threats, and false imprisonment, all conduct prescribed by PL 1020, PL 121.5, PL 13505, constitutes a crime of violence against plaintiff and is a crime of violence motivated by gender as defined in 110.1103. Defendants Harve Pierre, Interscope Records and Bad Boy Records have financially and otherwise benefited from these acts and omissions by keeping Mr. Combs, the volatile and explosive owner of Bad Boy Records, satisfied and benefited from facilitating his behaviour. Defendants Harve Pierre, Interscope Records and Bad Boy Records enabled, condoned, had knowledge of and failed to act to prevent or mitigate Mr. Combs' commission of the above-mentioned crimes of violence motivated by gender and are therefore also liable under the VGM-VPL. As a direct and proximate result of the above-mentioned crimes of violence and gender-motivated violence, plaintiff has sustained and will continue to sustain monetary damages and or economic harm, physical injury, pain and suffering, and serious psychological and emotional distress, entitling her to an award of compensatory and punitive damages, in conjunction and declaratory relief, attorneys' fees and costs, and other remedies as this court may deem appropriate. So this isn't the end of the case. There's quite a few more pages, but it's just basically going on to describe the damages caused, what she's suing for, how much, why, and just kind of going back through the case and using examples and things like that. But I've linked the entire case in the description so you can kind of go through. But yeah, just let me know in the comments what you think. That sounds mental. Yeah, that's the full reading. Thank you. Bye.